Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank. Dean, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Of course, thank you very much for the invite. My name is Dr. Dean Fido. I'm an associate professor in forensic psychology, and I'm based at a UK university.
Now, I came across a few of your works, and it's got me down this area of being interested in just kind of true crime. I think it gets involved with the whole discussion about serial killers, victims, the whole nine. But you had talked a lot about psychopaths or what classifies as a psychopath, and I wanted to get maybe a better take on it than my kind of description right there, where you typically focus or what you've written about when it comes to the nature of things that can get linked to true crime and this kind of like murderous mystery clue series.
Yeah, of course. So, psychopathy as a phenomenon is kind of a developmental disorder which has some biological underpinnings, it has some societal underpinnings, so things that we experience in our life which can contribute to that disorder. And it's typified by having this deficit in empathy, affect, so how we think and feel about other people, how we can resonate with their emotions. And it also has these underpinnings of this, I guess, behavioral element. So, do we engage in severe antisocial behavior, rule breaking? Are we really impulsive individuals who try to get what we want out of life, even though it means putting ourselves in front of other people? And that can oftentimes be really detrimental. In terms of how we go about measuring this, there are particular checklists and toolkits which can be used in, I guess, applied arenas. So if you are a forensic psychologist or a psychiatrist, you might be using these toolkits to give somebody a diagnosis, a label of being a psychopath. But there's a large, I guess, population of people in the scientific community, myself included, who believe that psychopathy can also be, I guess, positioned as a personality trait, so that everybody has some degree of psychopathy to a particular degree. So there might be people in the general population who haven't committed crimes, but they are really impulsive. They lack this ability to, I guess, empathically relate to somebody else and empathetically put themselves in their shoes. And they would have some degree of psychopathy, but not to a kind of a grandiose degree whereby that's clinically diagnosable.
Like, so someone that would act on something and do a horrendous act compared to someone who might just think about it. Or I think everyone has those moments, whether they get really upset or something, but they go, man, if I could just, this car in front of me, if I could just, push it off the road or something like that, just so I can get to where I'm going. That would be kind of a psychopathic trait when you say it out loud, but in your head, you're thinking about it. You're like, this is just going to make this anger go away.
Yeah, it even kind of maps onto, I guess, people at younger ages who might be stealing things from shops. They might be, I guess, joyriding, stealing cars, and kind of driving around recklessly. To, I guess, there's some, I guess, individual scientists, Louise Wallace included, and we might be talking about here a little bit more later, who believe that there's actually some benefit to having these psychopathic traits. So we might be looking at people who are in the military, people who are surgeons, people who are CEOs, who can actually be using these traits in a positive way for them in terms of positioning themselves so that they are getting the most out of their lives, even if it means treading on people to get to where they want to be.
Now, when we talk about psychopathy as a whole, how has it evolved over the years compared to like what it is known today compared to what it was like 20 years ago? I'd have to think with the rise of like mental health disorders that more people would maybe either not lower the bar, but kind of make it a little bit distinct when it's like this person's not a psychopath. They might seem like it, but it's just schizophrenia or it's something where their mind is doing it. It's not them personally. It's just a condition that they're suffering with.
Sure. So historically, if we kind of go back to the work of a gentleman called Hervey Cleckley, and he kind of developed this term, the psychopath, by looking at case notes within his files where he was identifying people who were perhaps able to outwardly facing when they were talking to people, being really engaging, being really confident in the things that they were saying, but the substance of what they were saying was completely lacking. So these might be patients in clinical settings who were never going to be released. And they were saying, well, actually, in a couple of years' time, when I'm successful, when I'm going to be doing this, or they might be talking about perhaps getting their children back when they are in such a, I guess, a state whereby they would never be granted access to their children upon release if they ever were released. And so he was identifying this typology of individuals who were very grandiose, very narcissistic, and that's what we kind of coin the modern day psychopath. That definition hasn't really, I guess, changed, but it's become more measurable, if that makes sense. So there's lots of different metrics, lots of different checklists, which are now developed to allow us to better identify individuals with these traits, with these behaviors. And a lot of that uses not only kind of one-to-one interviews with these individuals, but also their kind of case records. So, for example, we might be looking at the amount of crimes that they've been involved in, the severity of those crimes. And when you look at it like that, it's a very retrospective, I guess, assumption and kind of categorization of these individuals, which, as a side note, contributes to the fact that many can never be released because these numbers can't get lower. You can't have committed a lower number of crimes. But I guess the rhetoric and the way in which we talk about psychopathy has indeed changed. We do a lot of work that looks at how we need to be talking about these individuals within the general population, and not just people with psychopathy or psychopathic personality traits, but lots of different personality disorders and diagnoses. Because when we do talk about people, so for example, I think you mentioned schizophrenia, that when we talk about that in terms of the general population, and when we look at that in terms of media and film and TV shows, people immediately jump to the position that, okay, so they're talking to multiple different personalities and these individuals are very dangerous, when the statistics show us that's really not the case. And actually having these multiple personalities is a very low order manifestation of that diagnosis. And so actually being able to better educate the public and give clear definitions and almost change the terminologies that we use when we're talking about such individuals is really, really important. And that's the real crux and basis of my work in psychopathy.
It would be more with schizophrenia, would be like kind of like a warped reality. My buddy's mom ended up taking her own life. She had schizophrenia and stopped taking her medication for it. And it just got progressively worse. But there were scenarios that were being created that eventually you, if you were around it, you're like, this is a danger to me. This is a danger to everyone that would be around her in these scenarios. But there's no talking about it. It's just in their head, as much as this reality for all of us is this reality, that's their reality that is entering. So, I mean, that would be a trait that I would consider dangerous. But when we talk about psychopathic traits, I mean, what are the harmless ones? I mean, I think everyone has, like you mentioned, a little bit of psychopathy in them. So, what are the positive ones? I mean, not necessarily positive, but ones that we just don't even examine as being, oh, that's not going to be anything.
Yeah, of course. So one of the, I guess, the overarching traits is this ability to act in a very cold-hearted way. And so when we look at that in terms of, I guess, nurses, charity workers, that would be a very detrimental trait for them to be successful at their jobs. But if you are somebody who's working in the military and you have to make these life or death decisions, and you know that actually, okay, so actually, if I do shoot this individual, or I have to make a decision about whether to take the lives of many versus the lives of a few, you want people to be very cold-hearted and level-headed in terms of making those really important decisions. And the same applies to surgeons. If a surgeon is very emotionally empathetic with their clients and their patients, that could then interfere with the degree to which they can act in a really confident manner. However, if they do have this really, I guess, cold and confident personality where they are suggesting to themselves that they're excellent at what they do and they very rarely make mistakes, and so they have that clarity in their mind, these are the people that we want operating on us when we do find ourselves in those situations.
Now, is there a distinct gender difference between who would qualify more, or what is the prevailing number of people that get charged or locked away for psychopathic tendencies?
Yeah, so there's this overarching kind of number of around 1% of the population has psychopathic personality traits severe enough to land them in kind of a forensic setting to be arrested, to be charged. But that number is really difficult to tell because not only do we take a lot of that information from the states where people are charged, well, or diagnosed with psychopathy to a greater degree, and we have lots of penitentiaries where there's lots of easy and access to these individuals, to talk to these individuals. But that number can be heavily skewed. And one of the reasons for that is the way in which we measure psychopathy. So going straight back to what I was saying very early on about Hervey Cleckley's work and the kind of using case studies to identify individuals who might be ticking these boxes, what we find is that lots of the ways in which these questions are asked and the information gleaned from them is very much directed towards males. So, for example, when we're looking at the number of physically aggressive altercations somebody has been in, we know that men engage in physical aggression more than females do. And so lots of the questions within these diagnostic measures or the measures we use in the general population to look at personality traits are leaning towards identifying psychopathic personality traits in males.
Has it ever gotten to a point where you've been able to classify it so much that it would be like that what movie with Tom Cruise where you could predict if someone was, going to be a danger or have this threat? I'm not saying, future thinking or anything, but is there like a specific thing if you gave a personality test to someone who's young, you would be like, okay, this is more of a side we need to put under surveillance or we need to watch just in case? Because I mean, I'm sure it's multifactorial in the things that cause these type of tendencies or these really dramatic scenarios where someone does get locked up for a serious crime, which we can get to. But I was just wondering if you're able to look at a chart from, let's say, 30 years ago and be able to see either a rise, a decline, and if there's something that you can try and target it to be like, maybe it's because of this or maybe it's because of that.
So there's lots of work that's been done on kind of on that tangent about criminogenic behavior in general. And we're kind of looking back at the work of people such as Moffat, who was able to identify these patterns of behavior. So if you had X amount of traits of something, or you were from a dysfunctional family, let's say, kind of if we're dragging on those, I guess, stereotypical buckets, you do see individuals with this rising crime around the ages of 16 to 21, and then that's going to plateau and then it's going to start to decrease because people are getting older or people are less likely to engage in that. In terms of psychopathy, even though there's a little bit of work to do with, I guess, some of the more biological mechanisms and kind of the predictors of that kind of pure science, there's a huge gap in the research market that should be mapping on to this, I guess, life course progression of psychopathic personality traits, and that's something which has massively been missing. There are researchers which are starting to plug those gaps, and I think it's you were bang on the money where you were talking about this kind of multifaceted approach, and that's very much the approach we need. So we need these I guess these biological tests of testosterone, for example, and brain activity and how things are mapping onto and talking to each other in the brain at a very early age. We need to be tracking those kind of familial relationships, those social relationships, even things such as, I guess, friendships, how people are doing in school, opportunities that people get with jobs. And I think that's a really important facet to be looking at, because what we know from the forensic psychology literature is if people think they are being hard done by and not getting the breaks in life that they think they deserve, they're going to be identifying opportunities to make that happen. And that's where people might get pushed into these deviant peers or engaging in antisocial behavior because they think they deserve X, Y, and Z from life. And it's definitely an amalgamation of all of these things, which will contribute to the development of psychopathy. But there is a large genetic component as well. So even though we're talking about the development of psychopathy, there is some evidence to suggest that there are these kind of tendencies in maybe even in utero. So individuals that might be born with higher levels of testosterone might then go on to progress into individuals with psychopathy. So yeah, lots of work needs to be done there.
So with the kind of larger factor being men, that would be linked to the testosterone factor. But is that not definitive that you could point to that as being a major one? Because even with guys, when they fight afterwards, sometimes they'll shake hands and they'll go get a beer or something like that. So like you don't see the escalation of that. But with violent actions, I mean, are you seeing with men more? Is it like happening in a personal setting, like a family setting, compared to just an unknown person? For me, I would start classifying it differently being a psychopath. If someone just randomly decides to go out and kill somebody, a hitchhiker or something, That's insane. But then you have like scenarios where people have domestic violence disputes, and it's not good, whatever act that they did. But then you kind of look at it, you're like, well, there was a huge conflicting thing that was happening for like a whole generation that nobody was, they should have been separated, but nobody focused in on that. So we see it as a little bit of a different crime. It's even more horrendous in some acts because it's a family member. People consider the personal closeness, being an issue if you're going to get charged for killing somebody. OJ, I don't know, just somebody.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting take. So I think that there are charities which align themselves with looking at victims of psychopathy, which are in and about domestic abuse related charities. So these are individuals who, mainly women, who have had this really disruptive relationship. Individuals have acted in very antisocial ways, manipulative, controlling ways, things that we kind of normally pass off as, this basic domestic abuse, when actually this can be really heightened. It can be really impactful of social circles. So these men might be cutting women off from their friends, isolating them, not attributing them money. But in terms of how psychopathy is typically looked at in the literature, that's more entwined with aggressive behavior, which has just kind of come out of the blue. So this might be a reactive base of aggression where somebody might have this. It's called in the literature hostility bias. And what I mean by that is that these are individuals who they might just be, I guess, somebody might just pass them in a bar and not be really paying attention to them. They might not be looking at them in an aggressive way, but they might be attributing their facial expressions to being confrontational or to being aggressive. And that's where that, I guess, that outward aggression might come from. But it's important to say that not all psychopathic aggressive outbursts are impulsive, even though that's one major factor of the checklist. Other aspects might be this, I guess, planned and cold-hearted aggression. And so that's where we might have somebody wrong us in a social circle or a professional circle, and we might plan really manipulative yet high-end impact ways of, I guess, dealing with them at a later stage. So yeah, it's very difficult to tease apart this, this familial aggression and domestic abuse versus this outward explosive aggression.
When it comes to evidence on the basis of hormones, is there a way that we could be able to really define that more with research? If whether it's in the next 10 years or so, to be able to look at certain traits and be able to bring those down, like if you're going to use a hormone blocker, which I mean, I'm not recommending, but there was an episode of Joe Rogan's podcast where he had a guy from the Innocence Project on. I don't know if you ever heard this story.
I think I've actually seen the episode. Yeah.
But the guy afterwards, like a month later, chopped some dude's head off and again, he was on the show talking about everyone deserves a second chance. I'm 100% still for that. But it was just weird that that happened. And it makes you wonder, is this a curable thing? If someone who's prone to violence in their life, is it something that can be, and we obviously know people that have found God or something like that have done that. But I was wondering if this is something like, if it's if I gave you a Manson, could you fix that? I believe everyone is savable, but it might take an extended period of time or information or technology we don't have. So it's about wanting to put in that time, which a lot of our judicial system isn't necessarily about putting in the time for, but it brings up a question: if we're doing more research into hormones, if we're doing more research into personality aspects, could we find something where it could be either a medication or something to be able to tone down these psychopathic tendencies to the point where they can be a functioning member of society without giving them a lobotomy? Because that's like, we're past that. They tried it.
No, that's a really interesting take. So I kind of guess, if we go back to what we said about this being a mixing part, a boiling pot of different, I guess, biological elements, and that could be brain development, it could be hormones, added towards these kind of more social developmental factors, it gives almost too many targets, and we're not entirely sure the weight that which each biological factor plays in the development of psychopathy, and that might differ from person to person. So I'm very much from this kind of positivist perspective, whereby I believe that everything can be quantified and can be weighted, and we could intervene on each one of these separate nodes to a specific degree, which would then hopefully alleviate change further down the line. So I believe that with further research, yes, that would definitely be something that could be a target. What currently happens in terms of the treatment of psychopathy, and I say that with kind of air quotes because it's very much mixed success, is that psychopathy is seen as a barrier to treatment. So going back to what I was saying about the definition of psychopaths, we've got these individuals who don't take account for their own actions. They very much don't believe that they're ever wrong. They believe they're the best and they're the smartest person in the room. And they almost see other people as kind of, I guess, servants to them and people that they can manipulate to get ahead in life. And so if you're placed in a setting whereby you're trying to receive this, I guess, this talking treatments and this more socializing treatments, maybe in group settings, in a penitentiary, you're not, these psychopaths aren't going to be taking this information on board. They're going to be discrediting it. They're going to be really confrontational with people that are saying that they're wrong. And if that is a group setting, they're going to be really disruptive because they're going to want all the attention in that room to be on them. So in terms of these kind of talking therapies, there's lots of barriers to that being successful at the minute. And I think that a lot more does need to be done. It's an area that receives very little funding. And it's an area which is, I guess, extremely difficult to scientifically peer review. And what I mean by that is that there's so few psychopaths who are accessible that actually the research conducted on them, especially if you're looking at long-term change, becomes near impossible to conduct. So it's almost like we need more psychopaths to help the research, but that's obviously a negative thing to wish for.
Have you ever interviewed or watched any interviews with anybody who would be deemed as a psychopath?
So personally, not interviewed myself, but I've watched. I'd like to think 95% of everything that's out there. All
It's difficult. It's difficult to watch and be like, is this person real? Like, what are they like? Well, I watched Mark David Chapman and I've seen a couple of like his parole hearings and I'm like, I don't know what to say. Usually you get a good take on someone based on like body language or, when they say something, you go, I don't think I believe that. But then I think that's why people love watching court stuff so much because you're trying to solve who's like the guilty and all this like mystery stuff. But when you watch the interviews with people that have done like something insane, it's like there's no, I don't know how anybody could find research or be able to distinct if this person's telling the truth or not. It's like an actor. Like they will only want to be anyone that's not themselves. Like that would technically be a psychopathic trait because you're trying to pretend to be other things. So it makes it difficult.
Yeah, the so I've mentioned Hervey Cleckley a few times in this interview, but he coined his book on psychopathy was called The Mask of Sanity. And so that's very much what you're saying. It's that you've got this horrendous person in the background who's done countless negative things in their life, and yet when you're talking to them, when they're talking to a camera, it's this mask of sanity whereby they're talking as if nothing's wrong. And I think that yes, that could lead you to believe that they're lying. However, we have some anecdotal evidence of people in the general public with high levels of psychopathic personality traits who are very open and honest about their experiences because they think that they're correct. And so I think that as long as the questions that are being asked don't come across as trying to trick or deceive them or put them in a bad light, because we know that psychopathic individuals hate that, as long as you're trying to glean very clear evidence from them, they will be honest. But that honesty is about their own perspectives in life, which will very much, I guess, differ from the perspectives of typically functioning individuals and the general public.
How do you treat someone that doesn't know they're doing wrong and might not have the ability to learn that they are doing something wrong?
You very rarely can, and I think that's one of the issues that forensic practitioners face in terms of psychopathy. Um, you hit the nail on the head where it's kind of like it's almost as if you need to change these individuals' beliefs or reconceptualize the beliefs for them. But we know that they don't want to do that, because if you believe firmly that you are correct and you're unwilling to acknowledge information otherwise, why would you ever back down from your opinion? As typically functioning people in the general public, we very rarely want to look at the other side of the coin when we are adamant that we are correct. It needs a huge change, and I don't know how that happens.
Have you looked into the true crime obsession and had any kind of thoughts about what that does, if it has influential factors, dangerous or positive? I've heard it could be healthy to watch these types of shows and stuff like that, but again, it would depend on what you're viewing when you watch it. Are you thinking more about the victim, or are you thinking more about how the killer's getting away with it or trying to solve the crime? I believe everyone wants to be a detective. But I also believe some people are trying to live out a fantasy of like, I wish that was my boss, Gina. She took my parking spot, and they just start going. I'm like, all right.
Yeah, no. So we've done quite a lot of interviews, quite a lot of work, and we're also I've got a PhD student in a minute, Courtney Hammond, who's absolutely exceptional at what she does, looking at how not only I guess less so about our obsession with true crime, but more so in terms of how people who go on true crime shows, podcasts, experts who are talking on TV and film, their duties in terms of giving that accurate information whilst at the same time being engaging, whilst at the same time trying to convey these years of complex theory and information into something which is digestible for an audience. And it's very easy from our kind of our preliminary research, and I guess this is me being mindful being on this podcast, is that when experts are talking about these complex matters, it can be very easy for them to talk in really colloquial ways, which becomes meaningless, and also tend to miss some of the key concepts, which can, I guess, convey really poor science to the general public. But in terms of, I guess, going back to your question on like our obsession with true crime, I think when you said that everyone kind of wants to be a detective, if you think back to kind of childhood, and we all have these jobs about what we want to be when we grow up, it's like astronauts, it's police, it's detectives. And so from a very early age, we have this hunger for information and trying to figure things out. As humans, we're incredibly critical. We like to interrogate information. We like to make sure that we have all of the information necessary to make informed decisions. And when things don't, I guess, fully click with us, when we're presented with a puzzle, we try our best to undertake all of the actions needed to solve that puzzle. And so it's very easy to see how, as this kind of like cognitively functioning individuals, when we are now in a world where we have access to hundreds and hundreds, thousands of hours of true crime material, how we kind of lean into it and engage with it. It's very engaging and meaningful information, and it heightens that level of curiosity. I think that one of the things which is emerging in the literature, specifically, if I'm correct with this literature, it's more so seen in females than it is males, but this propensity for fear management. And so when we are left in a state whereby we are worried about, I guess, being a victim of crime or worried about crime in our local areas, we want to know how to protect ourselves and how to best, I guess, serve ourselves so we don't ultimately, I guess, get injured or die. We're from an evolutionary perspective, we want to live. And so when we do watch these true crime documentaries, it allows us to figure out how best we could have approached that situation. And I'm sure you might reflect in terms of the things that you've watched in the past, where you'd say, well, I would never do that. I would never leave myself in that vulnerable position. And that allows us to, I guess, reduce our own anxieties and start to feel less apprehensive about being victims of crime, because we start to see how, I guess, in quotes, best to act in that situation than sadly the many victims of those crimes.
Do you believe it influences behavior at all? Obviously, there's been many studies have done many discussions about video games causing violence. I don't believe it does. I think it might open up something that's already in there. But I don't think there's any evidence to support that if you play a video game, you're going to be violent right afterwards. But with the obsession of focusing on just deaths and murders and how things get plotted out, eventually you start thinking about it at work. and you're like talking to coworkers about it. Maybe it's a fun experience. For a lot of people, it is probably like a getaway. But eventually, I don't know if you've ever looked at the comments of some of these true crime videos, but people get really passionate about a subject and you realize, oh, this is like a sensitive event. Like it's not just, even if it was from 200 years ago, I'm seeing people saying, commenting on my buddy's channel that I knew that person, wife personally, and that's not right at all. And it's like, he tried his best. I mean, as a viewer, you got to look at that, but some people get really connected to it in such a way, whether they were actually connected to the experience or whether they just are so focused in on the subject as a whole, where I start going, man, you're seeing a little bit more violence in the comments, whether it's keyboard warriors or not.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and you raise a couple of points. I think the very first thing you mentioned about the video games and violence, that very much taps into what we were saying about the importance of whether it's a documentary, whether it's someone appearing on a podcast to give this really, I guess, stringent and clear information, because it was a huge rhetoric in the States, in the UK for years about this tie-in between video games and aggression. Oxford University released a meta analysis of all of the studies on it, and showed no effects of video games on violence, which, it's something which makes sense when you think about it, but it's very easy to make that narrative around. In terms of whether or not true crimes change our behavior, being able to experience vicariously through victims, or I guess perpetrators even, or members of the public who are witnesses, we can almost see the potential endpoints of our hypothetical behavior. So if we are engaging in behaviors X, Y, and Z, this has a heightened propensity for us to become victims of such crimes. And so we might change our behaviors implicitly so that we don't engage, and we don't kind of mirror what we've seen on TV. But there is also that broader behavioral change in terms of, okay, so actually, do we start talking about this more to colleagues? Do we get other people interested? And does this become I guess, a passion project for us? And that's almost where this, I guess, this obsession with true crime starts to boil, in that we are in 2024, like, we can't get away from such media, right? So for example, if we don't explicitly hunt for it on TV or film, we passively get it on Instagram and TikTok, because it's something which people are interested on, so they're sharing that material, and then it gets, I guess, passed on to more and more and more. So we can't get away with it, which becomes a very interesting phenomenon. But what we don't know, and I think this is really important because of this proliferation of media, is how engagement in true crime media now will impact us in 10, 15 years. It could be beneficial. It could kind of test our critical thinking skills, but it could also be detrimental, in that it could potentially increase our anxieties about crime. Going back to, I guess, some things really early on that we was talking about, in terms of things that happen very far away typically, and we don't engage ourselves with it. But then when people become victims of crime that we know about, or we see in the local media, that starts to heighten our interest. It starts to heighten our aggression. But then it goes away because we don't hear things for a number of months. But if we are constantly getting these reminders on social media, and I guess more written media even, about incidents of crime, then it's going to make us feel cognitively that crime is all around us, and then heighten those fears.
I do want to make a comparison, and then you can agree or disagree with me on this, but there's a superhero culture of people that are focusing into the subject. And now everyone has now understood this is a great template in Hollywood to use. Well, during social media, constantly putting up TikToks of mysterious murders and trends and all this, it's now become documentaries on Netflix. And media realizes that they can really tap this template of true crime and make the Dahmer series and a bunch of other things that get people to start getting, watching it. Well, eventually you're walking down the street and people are wearing true crime shirts and they're wearing a bunch of like murders, Jeffrey Dahmer shirts. I'm like, well, in my opinion, you're glorifying the guy by wearing a shirt like that. But it really kind of the trend of it scares me because I think it increases people's fears and their associations with wanting to have interactions with people because they're thinking these seminal thoughts in their head. Like I said, it's probably very little evidence to support that, but there's a lot of things where media eventually it becomes the only thing. These are pushing into your head. And like you mentioned with like social media, that's every video now is about a horrible murder. I can watch, honestly, like watching like a wildebeest rip apart like a snake or something. That's cool. But like if there's a person and it's like she was 13 years, I'm like, oh God, I don't want this is 5 o'clock in the morning. I can't do that.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with what you're saying. I think that especially when money gets involved, in terms we can see your Netflixes, your Amazons can start to gain income because of the traction that putting documentaries out has. And it's very rare now to see a tragedy or an event which gains public interest that isn't made into a documentary series. Um, I mean, even if you think about, so you can look historically at, I guess the instance with, well, I mean, let's go even more recently with the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case
I
that's
was
been
literally
made
going to
into,
mention that too. Yeah.
yeah, it's been made into a docu-series for people's, I guess, enjoyment now. Okay,
It
so
was
we
pretty
we just
good.
can't get away. I
It
haven't watched it yet. I haven't watched it yet. I watched the trial, but I don't know kind of like what the recent documentary kind of features and how it's been produced. But I'm looking forward to that.
They
But
got
yeah,
influencers in it, like the people that were voicing it on YouTube and talking about it and like doing react videos, which I've never really seen in a documentary before. That was a hilarious take because if you watched it when it happened live,
mm,
you're like, oh, I remember when this guy did this video and made this song about Amber.
yeah, and it caused a media storm then, and it's a way of kind of companies to generate income from that now, which is I guess an endless loop of being able to generate content about true crime, about psychopaths, about homicide, and anything you want, even down to sexual abuse. I think that one of the things that's important to remember is that we need to be mindful of the victims of these crimes. Um, we've had a lot of recent Netflix specifically, I think, documentaries of serial killers from the past, people with psychopathy from the past. And even though this is years and years after the original event, now we're retelling those stories and we're bringing in the likenesses of victims, the likenesses of friends and family. And it almost means that we need to be mindful and we should be mindful, especially the media, of how this can act to re-victimize victims or families of victims. And I think that that's not nearly talked about as much as it should be.
They're making a documentary about the Gabby Petito, the missing influencer that honestly I hadn't ever heard of before it was showing on the news and everything. But the family was going to sue because they didn't get the permission from the family. And you got to think about from the family's perspective, but then also how many people go that deep into it? They only want to watch something good that's going to catch their attention on things. But if we examine things like the Dahmer series and stuff like that, what do you think about documentaries that focus on a essential just one person compared to like something like the Zodiac Killer is different. Someone that doesn't have a name. I mean, they didn't publish terrorist names because they didn't want to glorify the actions by putting this person's name in a newspaper. Now we're making whole documentaries about certain serial killers and psychopaths, whether they're alive or whether they're dead. Now it's getting people to go onto their phone, look up more information about the person, or go and find another one, another rare case, a disappearance or something like that. And then next thing you know, you're having all this attention get dragged into a horrible event where people will contact the family members or anyone that could be associated with it. I did try to get OJ a couple. He's been like my dream guest to get. All I want to do is talk about Naked Gun, and then this guy goes and dies on me. I literally haven't looked into the murders, but I watched the 30 for 30, like a brief couple minutes of it. And the guy who sent OJ, the guy who got murdered by OJ, and that guy was actually sleeping with OJ's wife. And he's on Instagram. He's actually a really nice guy. I'm trying to get him on here, but then I go, I'm doing the same thing by wanting to learn about this traumatic experience about this person, but it's also history. So then you're kind of in like
Mm.
a cultural thing where it's like, do I stand by ethics and not try and bring up something that might be traumatizing? But if they're open to it, do you go and do it?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly no kind of clear cut answer about whether we should be producing as much media on this as possible or avoiding it completely. I don't think we should be avoiding things completely. I think that the public have a right to know. I think that the public benefits a lot of the time from knowing, and teaching history. We can't just erase history. We shouldn't ever erase history. But whatever actions are being taken need to be done being very mindful of the victim's family. In kind of education, we've moved towards a model of co-production, whereby we might be developing educational material, then going out to people from different cultural backgrounds that we know are going to be our students, whether they're online learners, whether they're on campus learners, and saying, okay, so actually, does this come across well to you? Are there any questions? Do I need to be adapting this material any way to be sensitive to your learning needs? And I can definitely see a model whereby if there is a production being made on offense X and it might feature victims A, B, and C, actually going to their families, getting a little bit of that okay, getting their input in terms of what can we talk about, what shouldn't we talk about, what would you like to be kept private, because the general public don't need to know every single intrinsic detail about a case to learn and understand it and appreciate it. And I think that that level of co-production, yes, it takes a lot more time. Yes, it's more expensive, but these companies have that money. They have that time, and so actually that would be a really ethical way of finding a nice marriage between going full on and actually doing nothing at all.
From when you first started your academic career compared to where you are now, on the subject as a whole, when it comes to true crime or when it comes to just murders or psychopathic tendencies in general, how has it evolved? And has it been influenced at all by just, I think during the pandemic was when the true crime genre really took off. I'm just wondering if it was in the past couple of years you've kind of had a different change of opinion, or has it been a slow pace over time?
That's a really great reflective question. Never thought about that, but my immediate responses are in terms of work with psychopathy, it's become very much more moving away from these high profile cases and looking more about how these unique personality traits manifest and have an interplay within the general population. I think that's I think that's something which is really important for us to know. We need to be moving away from this classification of people as psychopaths or non-psychopaths and looking at personality traits as a whole on a continuum. I'm very proud of that work. In terms of the true crime aspect, I think that that's very much been in the back of my mind for I guess the majority of my career, in that I've been a passive consumer of this. And I guess I've never really thought about being that consumer until, as you mentioned, COVID. People were indoors, people were striving, looking for this, I guess that this way to disengage from society and to look after themselves and safeguard themselves. Lots of anxieties, which they were, I guess, masking with knowledge about crime, and the statistics show themselves, just the complete outcry and outburst of all of these true crime shows, and added to that the proliferation of TikTok on top, which it was very, I guess, dormantish up until COVID, and TikTok exploded, as we all know. And so I think in terms of the true crime aspects, the last 4 or 5 years, that's been extremely noticeable. And now that very much informs a lot of my work, even if it's not in psychopathy. I'm always looking to see, okay, so actually I need to be mindful of how I'm presenting this complex information, because I don't want somebody to be, I guess, tuning into this podcast and taking a snippet of what I've said completely out of context. So I'm always making sure that I'm contextualizing what I say, and where possible, adding this evidence informed practice. And I want to almost use that as good practice for other individuals who are doing this. But it's so difficult, I think, to kind of reach that majority.
Now, when it comes to your passive consumption of kind of like the true crime genre. I mean, as an interest, that is an interest for you as like a just a like you find it not just research based, but you're looking at it like you actually enjoy. And what do you enjoy out of it? Do you enjoy it more if the person focuses on the victim, or do you enjoy it more if they talk more about kind of the mindset of the killer or how they conducted the act? Because I hate to say it, but I do like listening more about the killer when I'm trying to figure out, like, damn, he did it like that. Like, this guy wiped the phone and everything with gloves, and then the glove didn't fit. I'm just something like, I'm just
Of
joking, but
course, of course, of
yeah.
course. I think for me, it's if I'm looking at it as a passive viewer, and I'll speak for my partner as well on this subject. Um, we both prefer, I guess, neither the victim nor the perpetrator. We more like to hone in on, I guess, either the police's perspective as they're investigating this and any mistakes that they've made along the way, as well as the evidence in terms of how people have been able to put this puzzle together. And so I think that the one which we both enjoyed the most was when we was watching Making a Murderer, because that allowed us to very much hone in on those individual puzzles and aspects and how A doesn't map onto B. And so it's a little bit more, I guess, critical consumption at that time. So that for me is what I most enjoy. I also like it when, um, I guess to some extent, I like it when the crime has been solved because I can see an outcome of that. Where I know a lot of times, lots of true crime media has been made where people have either never been caught, or there's lots of doubt as to the, I guess, the conviction that's been made. Quite frustrating.
The mysterious disappearances or mysterious deaths. I've looked it up. You can find like a long list of it online of like on Wikipedia or whatever. There's been a lot, and I've never heard of half of those names. But they're interesting when you're reading through them because they start back to like the 20s when they started being reported. And they're just like minor, like this person just was never seen again. And then they get more detailed as you get more towards where media is like massively influencing. But when it comes to looking at the policeman's perspective, do you have any thoughts about changes about how a lot of these things get done? Because just from speaking with a lot of journalists and looking into like a lot of government documents, whether you want to call it conspiracy talk, whatever, I mean, just focusing on like, what does the document say? Where can I find this out of the FBI's report or the CIA's report? I've started to examine the policeman's perspective too. And I go, this would be a lot better. And this probably would be handled in a whole different scenario than just putting a guy to the chair if they knew about mental health issues, which at a lot of times these cases happen. There wasn't a big awareness on certain types of disorders. But it's a factor where we talk about police now when they're investigating something. If they put themselves in the mindset of the killer and trying to examine that there could be something here, instead of giving them death or locking them away for so long, you would examine more alternative treatments.
Yeah, it's so difficult because I think a lot of the information that we get in true crime documentaries is retrospective in nature. Lots of these cases are finished, are done. People have been convicted. People are lots of them come as the perpetrator passes away or gets released, and so they are very retrospective in nature. If you were then to, I guess, contact the officers in a professional manner, they are not going to, I guess, change perspectives. They're not going to give counter reports. They might not even want to feature or even talk to you. And so we are left with this puzzle and this almost this frustration about, well, okay, so actually, why don't you know this? Why didn't you take this into consideration? And I think as passive viewers, especially those educators in that have degrees in psychology or criminology or forensic psychology, um, we are motivated to be asking these questions. And when I'm with my students, I push them to ask these questions. I want them to interrogate this data. I think, especially in terms of the mental health angle, even though lots of true crime documentaries come from the States, very little of that police knowledge and I guess perspective is documented from UK cases. That seems to be a drastic omission, if you're comparing it. But there is room across the world for greater institutional knowledge of mental health disorders or even the nuanced ways in which these disorders can manifest. We're just publishing a paper at the minute which looks at labels. So we made this kind of experimental study where we attributed different labels to different diagnoses and included them in a court report. And we actually included a condition for psychopathy. And what we found with that is that when people were described the traits of a psychopath, they would give this very normative approach in that these individuals could be rehabilitated. It could be a one-off crime, and we're not going to be really punitive about their offence. But as soon as you start to add labels to reports, calling people a psychopath or saying that these people have psychopathic personality traits or schizophrenic traits, we even replicated it with an autistic label, and we found the same. The perpetrators within these short stories, they were deemed to be dangerous and not able to be rehabilitated. And it kind of maps onto that common sense psychology, but it just evidences to us that the general public need to be educated on these nuanced disorders. It's so important, but missing in curriculums worldwide.
Do you believe that societal trauma has an impact into the way that we view some of these serial killers, like the more popular ones? Specifically, I don't know if you know too much about this, but in the not Gavin Newsom let out Leslie Van Houten, which was she was involved with the Manson murders, and that was a big stink. A lot of people were not happy about that, even though you could say she served her time. I mean, there's different opinions on it for sure. I'm not going to diagnose that, but it's a traumatic cultural thing where a lot of people just to them it wasn't even a question. Like it was like, why would you do that? And it makes you kind of think, did anybody talk to her and ask what, she's different? Have you interviewed her? Have you talked to her personally? So there was a real line where I started to thinking more about societal trauma and giant acts. If someone that we love today, God forbid, was taken out by somebody, then when you look at that, would we view them as giving them a chance or opportunity to explain why and justify their action and do an investigation, or would it be straight to jail and locked away for however long until we felt comfortable?
Mm, that's a really great point. I think that um, we're very much, I guess, the States, the UK, lots of the Western world at the minute, including Europe. We're in a world whereby we're very individualistic and we've lost those societal values. But there are lots of instances, such as crimes that impact broad societies, that allow us to gel back together. And to some extent, you can say the same with COVID, right? In that societies became more ingrained because they were facing this worldwide phenomenon all at once. And I think that when perpetrators who have been involved in those more broader offense types, so for example, serial killings and the like, there does come a time when people are being let out of prison that becomes um especially for people that aren't educated around rehabilitation and they have these very strict values that nobody can be rehabilitated. um I guess it's part and parcel of my job to firmly believe that everybody can and should be given a second opportunity, and that's kind of my stance on things. I am conscious that there's certain crimes where people will be more outspoken than others, but it does force us as individuals and also as a community to give that, I guess, abhorrent reaction and say no, we don't want this in the slightest. When we are talking about kind of rehabilitation, I think when we don't know a perpetrator, we can be a little bit more, I guess, available to allow them to reintegrate and to get jobs within society. But when these individuals are very much known to us, when they're trying to be reintegrated back in societies where their family, where their friends or their former friends, peers are, that can be really tricky. And it's it's understandable why people have these, I guess, really adverse opinions about that.
Does this label down to case by case basis? When we talk about killers, yeah, because I don't know if you knew about this or if you've ever heard this before, but during when the Holocaust and everything was happening, there's accounts from people that were in these camps, and there's psychopaths in the camps that are killing people. Like they had a local or camp murderer, basically, from a diary from one girl. I think her name's Belsha, and she explained in her diary that everyone knew this was the resident killer. And you start learning about that person and you go, oh my God, they locked somebody up here with a psychopath, basically. Nope. they were just didn't want the guards beating them up, so they ended up killing a bunch of people just to, please the guards. And you go, that is a different thing of a psychopath than what I would consider Jeffrey Dahmer or any other person you could watch that gets trended an article about. So I think it's when we talk about case by case basis. I mean, putting labels on things can be good for some instances, but when we talk about overall, when you're looking at or viewing a crime like this or a murder, how would you want to approach it in an ethical way if you would deem it ethical to just view something like this and give a breakdown on something?
It's very difficult. I think that lots of time, and the example you just gave is a perfect, I guess, amalgamation of what I want to say, in that you're limiting your perspectives on this case to somebody's account. And then you might be, I guess, back ending it with further information as you explore it and go down the line. When it comes to people with psychopathy or people that commit heinous crimes, we look at it at face value, and it's really important for us to do that deeper exploration, try to understand all of the developmental reasons. And it's never in a way to, I guess, excuse that behavior, because we shouldn't be excusing that behavior at all. But knowledge comes with power, right? And so if we become knowledgeable about this case by case basis, about what contributed to circumstances, that not only better allows us to understand whether somebody can be treated, but if they can, how to go about that treatment, and more so how to prevent reoffending from occurring in the future. So it's really important for us, if we are looking at things on a case by case basis, to be gathering as much information as we can. And for me, that's the most ethical way of going about that discussion. I think it's highly unethical to, I guess, treat everybody as a single phenomenon.
I just got one last question for you, but I do appreciate your take on some of these because I've always heard everybody just go immediately to putting that person in the chair or something like that. And I'm really kind of about rehabilit. Everyone can be saved, in my opinion. I don't think you need God or anything to do it. I just think you got to give a little bit extra time. It took me a long time to get through math class. But when we examine the rise, have you seen a difference in that there's child um, psychopaths or killers compared to how it was maybe 20, 30 years ago? I'm wondering about that with the influence of social media. I'm not saying it's doing anything to them. I just think they're being exposed to a lot of things. And I think you eventually become numb to it. Like, I don't know how many videos I've scrolled past of like people getting their head chopped off or something where I'm just like, I don't got time to watch. It's 20 minutes, man. They skip.
Yeah, I mean that's a very fair question. From the, I guess, scientific perspective, children can't be psychopaths, and I think that's something which is really important as a take home. There's no way in which we currently diagnose children as psychopaths. Now, we might say that they have oppositional defiance disorder, or we might say they have conduct disorder, that these individuals are increased in callous and emotional traits, but we'd never use the word psychopath in and around children. And that's kind of a number of reasons, one of which is the kind of labeling aspect that I talked about. Once somebody gets a label, it's difficult to shift that label, and it can then have adverse effects on their life. The other factor is going back to what I was saying very early on about these measurement tools that we have. Lots of them look at offense histories from the ages of 15 onwards, and we're looking at these kind of retrospective frequencies. And we can't be doing that with children because they fall out of these measurement ranges. So there's a kind of an ethical reason we don't do it, and also a logistics reason we don't do it. But having said that, if we are looking at these callous and emotional traits in children, I don't know of any research which directly looks at amplification. I don't know any research which looks at kind of media mapping onto this. But anecdotally, if we are kind of going back to the fact that, let's take, I guess, TikTok, for example, or in fact, Twitter X, where it's got a lot more, I guess, pornography, it's got a lot more violence, which is, at least on my X feed, is not being moderated to the degree that it was previously. It doesn't. It's not a million miles away from understanding how children can start to see more of this media, how they can almost start to blunt their effective responses to it. They can normalize it because that's what they're seeing. Going back to what we are saying about domestically abusive relationships, if we are seeing more sexual aggression in pornography, that can then be taken forward to seeing how we might, in quotes, normatively engage in sexual relationships, which of course is incorrect. And looking at what you were saying in terms of that, I guess, gruesome violence and that gore, then that can further blunt those effective responses and almost see this as being quite normative. So I would hazard a guess that this lower empathy, greater impulsivity, because if we're looking at TikTok, we're looking at these 10-15 second videos. We're not adding that critical evaluation to all of the information that we're getting. And if we are being blunted and become numb to people's stresses and strains in life, that could well contribute more to a heightened level of callous and emotional traits in children. And then as soon as they're in adulthood, those kind of more broadly defined psychopathic traits and low empathy and affect.
It's a complicated subject, but it's an interesting one, and I'm glad I can see why you can focus into something like this for sure. But Dean, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah, so I'll give you my kind of LinkedIn, which will have all of my papers and whatnot on, but you can also find me on Twitter X at dfido1.
I'll make sure I link all those in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.